Hi there. I wanted to share another bit of research that was absolutely amazing, that's super relevant to a lot of this journey that I've been on. And I wanted to summarize it here. I discovered it when someone had forwarded an article from the or Scientific American. No, it was Atlantic Magazine, and it was called We No Longer Need Brains, Simple Cells Can Do It. And it was basically about how there's a surprising degree of intelligence outside the brain. And the article went through like the different types of intelligence. There's like in plants and animals. So it talked about examples of, for example, bees can communicate in sign language, recognize faces, and communicate the location of far-flung flowers to each other. And then plants, for example, like touch-me-nots or forget-me-nots, if you touch them, they'll retract. And what they did was if they touched it frequently but didn't damage it or hurt it, then it would stop retracting. And it would retain that memory even a year later, or I think it was a month later, it would still have retained that memory. And then they talked about planaria, worms. And they talked about this professor, Michael Levin at Tufts University that did this research. And what they were saying was that if you chop off the tail or the head of a worm, it'll regenerate their tail. In fact, if you chop it up into 277 pieces, I think was the number, they'll all regenerate. And then what he showed was that they had memory. So he would basically, he would train it. So for example, if you have a petri dish with a corrugated center, the worms will stay along the edges. The planaria will stay along the edges. They won't move. But when he put liver in the center, then they would move. So he had two petri dishes. He had one where they were corrugated and others that were smooth. And he put liver on both the centers, and then, they all went to the food. Then he chopped all their heads off. And they all regenerated, and the ones that were in the petri dish that had to go over the corrugated one were faster. Every generation thereafter was faster than the ones that went through the smooth one. So what he was finding was he wasn't changing the hardware; it was the software was changing. Like it was able to learn, it had memory. So there's a whole new field that's emerging. That's and the other thing that was interesting about it was, where is the intelligence then? He chopped off the head, it would regenerate, but he chopped off the tail, it would regenerate, and he chopped in all these pieces. So where's the intelligence? So there's a whole new field of study that they refer to that's called basal cognition, which is basically the idea that there's intelligence at the cellular level that has the hallmarks of intelligence: memory, problem solving, and learning. So what Professor Levin was able to do was he was able to generate a bioelectric pattern to create an eye on a tadpole, like on the tail. And the reason this is so interesting is that it was a fully functioning eye. They tested it. The reason this is interesting is that he didn't have to learn the biochemistry of creating eyes on tadpoles. He just figured out an API, a way to leverage the intelligence of the system to do what he wanted to do. So the example he's provided that I like is, imagine you wanted to make a tower. So humans, let's say they build it out of Legos. Let's say there's a huge wind that, comes and ends up, knocking over the tower. Well, humans would go in and they rebuild it, Well, what if it was a tower of dogs? Of course, all the dogs would run off unless you train them with treats. And then if the wind came and blew them over, they all just reform automatically into the tower. So the point is, you don't need to learn the biochemistry or whatever, the biology of a dog, and how do you get it to stay in a tower. You use an API, a way to interface with the system, in this case a treat, to train it to leverage the intelligence of the system. Okay, so what he did then was Professor Levin was able to show that he could create tumors and remove tumors with bioelectric patterns. And the way he described a tumor was it's simply a group of cells that's separated from the whole and has a separate goal, a different goal in the collective. And the reason that's interesting to me is that, let me back up a second. The reason the whole leveraging the API of the system, or using an API to leverage the intelligence, it was interesting to me is that that's what I discovered, is that if I can tap into my higher self, it can actually, it can do a lot of things that my conscious mind can't do, because it's connected to the subconscious and to greater intelligence. And so that can be, if we can figure out the API to connect to the higher self, then we can leverage a greater intelligence of the system. Okay, and the next thing was, the definition of a tumor. So he was able to create tumors and remove tumors with bioelectric patterns. And if you think about it, a tumor is just a group of cells that separates from the whole, has a separate goal in the collective. So if you think about it in organizations, maybe that's what humans are. Maybe that's if there's, let's say, a culture that isn't healthy, and people now start having their own goals, they don't have collective interest, they have individual interests. And so maybe that's, if you could introduce a bioelectric pattern, so to speak, or the equivalent of in an organization, you could get people to start operating more collectively as opposed to independently. And so he showed this. He was able to take, when he put like these cells in a marinade, a drug marinade that prevented them from separating, they would never develop cancer. So cancer is simply, cells that have broken off, tumors, and they have their own goals. So the cancer now has a separate goal in your human body, and that creates its own havoc as a result of that. So there's implications for regenerative medicine, for like medicine, like cancer, through this research. And then what he did that was really interesting was he took a frog cells and lungs, like frog cells, skin cells from a frog, and he was able to put them in a petri dish, remove the instructional cells. And what they started to do was they started to bind to each other and solve bigger and bigger problems. So they started going around corners and healing, they ended up with wounds or injuries, whatever. They would start healing them. There's no nervous system, there's no brain. So what he's alluding to is that, and he's also done this with human lung cells. So now he's creating anthrobots and xenobots, like robots, that are a blend of artificial and natural intelligence, living intelligence, and to create these, to do various things that might be useful in the body to heal wounds or whatever. And what he basically was suggesting then was, at the cellular level, the natural desire is to connect to others and to solve bigger and bigger problems. And so there was an interesting experiment research that he then did, which he started adding eyes, noses, and mouths in all the wrong places on these tadpoles. So they were like Picasso tadpoles, they looked weird. But then what he found was, in every case, those tadpoles would turn into perfect frogs. Now this is not algorithm, like tadpole to frog. He's doing things that are not, you wouldn't expect in nature. It's not natural to have 50 eyes on the tail or whatever. But what he was finding, so what he redefined then was, collective intelligence is the ability to achieve the goal, the morphogenetic goal, despite the perturbations or trauma, resilience. So the system was intelligent enough that it could deal with these different things that would come up in nature or artificially injected to still reach its goal. And then what he started discovering was, well, how does it know when to stop? How does it know that it has to get 2 eyes, not 4, 8, 50, or whatever? So what he started discovering and hypothesizing around was this concept of morphogenetic. So, within a certain space of that, I guess, being, creature, whatever, it's got a certain goal. It's supposed to get to a certain size, have certain characteristics and parameters, whatever. And that's kind of, I guess, coded somewhere in the system. So it knows when to stop. And so, you might wonder that about the humans, what are our soul journeys, so to speak, or what's the goal that the subconscious keeps trying to work towards? Maybe what we give our goals that we give ourselves or we give our subconscious. And it continues to try to work towards that goal possibly. But anyway, the thing that he also mentioned then was the cells will recruit other cells. So if there's not enough cells, for example, like a tumor or anything that it's trying to create, doesn't have enough to do what it needs to do, it'll start recruiting other cells around it. And so then you think about in the context of energy and vibration, it starts to entrainment, draw other cells. And this becomes relevant in the context of one of the things that I discovered. So let me take this further, this research and why it's so powerful. So if you think of trauma they say is like fragments. We physically, emotionally, mentally, you end up with more fragments. And what healing does is it's wholing. It's essentially reducing the fragments. They become part of the whole. So it's almost like healing the tumor cell or the cancer cell or the trauma that then merges with the, the whole self again, the integrated self or, the higher self. And so that you have less fragments in your system and you have more collective intelligence. And so I think as you heal trauma, one, my hypothesis is that the system becomes more intelligent. There's less fragments. But two, if you think about the human, we're just a collective intelligence. We're a collection of cells. We started as a single zygote, a single cell, and then we became a multicellular organism. And every, creature is that. It depends on, and you have a whole spectrum. And so, you have from the smallest, number of cells, the lowest intelligence, all the way to larger, maybe even greater than humans. And he alludes to maybe weather or maybe other species or, intergalactic or whatever. You could go on and on around that. But essentially then, you could look at how many cells and how intelligent and how resilient, how able is it to deal with. And he even talks about predictive powers. The larger that the being becomes, the more predictive powers it has. So intuition. But I think what's happening is there's a book Okay, well, let me go back to trauma. So as you heal the trauma, you become more whole, you reduce the fragments. There's a book that I read called Extended Mind by Annie Murphy Tall, an investigative journalist. And she talked about different levels of cognition. So there's, she talked about embodied cognition, and that's like the body. And that's one of the last research piece I shared around interceptive accuracy, which you're welcome to check out, look at. But essentially, self-awareness or interceptive accuracy improves P&L and reduces anxiety. But anyway, the whole point they're making is that tuning into the body actually increases, in that case, decision-making and P&L, but it actually improves cognition. So she talked about like kids that are moving, that have hands-on learning, for example, do better on tests. I think they looked at GREs than people that are forced to sit and be still. And then she talked about even like fidgeting. So like people that are fidgeting, they have she called it gestural foreshadowing. They essentially, the thought becomes concrete through movement. It's abstract, and then it's through the movement because the body is more intelligent. And she talked about the mind being more than just the brain. It extends into the body in this case, and it can pick up on things and synthesize things before it becomes conscious or you become aware of it. And so that was like the embodied cognition. Then there was situated cognition. So the environment you're in, your sense of belonging, will affect your cognition. One example that I really remember that resonated with me was that people who walk down tree-lined streets had higher cognition than people who walk down traffic-lined streets. And so back to the context of Levin's research, maybe it's because when you walk in nature or you walk amongst the trees and stuff, you're a bundle of cells and connection of cells. Maybe you're connecting to the cells of nature, like trees and insects and whatever, and you have a greater intelligence, greater cognition. Anyway, something to think about. And then the last one was distributed cognition. The idea that groups of individuals, like hive mind now, so I think Jonathan Haidt talks about this as like bees and ants, colonies, they operate like a hive, like humans. He talked about like psychedelics and ecstatic dance, I think rave, or ways that you could turn on the switch, like the military and dance troops and so on, they get into this hive mind. And Stealing Fire talks about this idea of group flow. And so military uses this to do stealth, like dangerous operations. They would teach people how to get into the state of group flow so they could operate like a single entity. So now you're talking about collective intelligence. So anyway, coming back to this research then, the idea is that you can now leverage this for all kinds of things. So as an example, you have, if you look at like Vipassana, okay, and this is something that was shown to me when I was at the 10-day silent retreat, they talk about sankharas. Sankharas are these like basically habit patterns or traumas in our system. And essentially what happens is any of the five senses is a signal that comes into the system. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. And essentially it has a vibrational frequency. And there can be a resonant frequency in the sankhara, in the trauma or the habit pattern in my system that resonates with that. So it starts to vibrate in my system. Now, if I react, I'm basically reinforcing, and it's like that reaction is coming from that trauma. So it's an autonomic response. I think in the case of neuroscience, right? It's like I go into a version of fight or flight. My conscious mind kind of shuts down. The subconscious takes over. That particular trauma comes to the surface. And now the thoughts, the feelings, the sensations, the sensory movements and perceptions of that trauma so I'm reliving that experience and I'm going to behave like I might have at the age that I registered that trauma. Like 6-year-old, so I'm speaking and thinking and feeling like a 6-year-old or whatever. Like that's how it works in neuroscience. In the case of Vipassana, what they talk about is there's an autonomic response. I can't control myself, and I'm going to say and do things that made my worst self now because it's my trauma response. And because my conscious mind is shut down, my best self is connected to that. It's kind of shut down, and so I do things I might regret. And when I come back to center, I'm like, oh my God, what did I do? Or I can't believe I did that. Or I'm sorry I did that. I couldn't control myself or help myself. And in the case of Vipassana, the way I describe it is these sankharas. They're associated with, and what they talk about in Vipassana is, so a signal comes in, your mind looks in the memory bank to recognize it. It generates a sensation somewhere on the body that you may or may not pick up. That's either pleasant, it can be pleasant or unpleasant. Then you have an emotional reaction to that if it's unpleasant at a subconscious level, or and if it's a strong reaction, aversion or craving, I hate it or I love it. Then you either generate or multiply sankharas, these habit patterns in the system, and the sankhara comes with mental action, vocal action, physical action. So these are autonomic responses with it. Now, if you're able to control yourself, you may not do all that. But if it's so strong in your system, like they talk about sankaras and how deeply ingrained are they in your system, how big are they in your system? It could be ingrained, like they talk about, in water, in sand, or in stone. So if it's a deeply ingrained one, it comes up, it shuts down my conscious mind even more. I can't help myself. So I might go ahead and do one or more of these things. Mental action, have been angry thought. Vocal action, I say something. Physical action, I do something. So essentially then when you do that, you react. It basically reinforces the neural pathway, the habit pattern, the trauma, the sankara, and it gets bigger in the system. It multiplies. So now I have more of those, let's say, collection of cells in the context of Levin's research. It's recruiting more cells through entrainment because I reinforced it. So it becomes bigger in my system, the trauma. Now, if you think about it, each one of those, like you think about the human, is a collection of cells that grew out of one single cell. Well, my hypothesis is that sankara, that trauma, that habit pattern is growing in your system if you're reinforcing it. So it's becoming bigger, almost like a whole person within you. Like we're talking about fractals now. So it could be like a being inside me that has a voice. And so I hear voices. And when they're smaller, they're not as overwhelming. And when they're larger, they can be screaming voices like I might have in schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder. And so essentially then it's like the higher self, which is connected to consciousness and it's connected to my conscious mind, is there as long as I'm not triggered. So that's why you can kind of do your best self things, when you're conscious. But most of the day, they say 95% of the day, we get distracted and our subconscious running the show. And so we're at mercy of whatever's in our subconscious. And if we get triggered, any one of the triggers that emerges, whatever is with that trigger, the sankara that's with that trigger, which is like the actions and how much it shuts down the mind, is going to be running the show. So essentially then it's like I have this voice or this being or this creature that's basically like running the show, or a large voice in my system. And the larger my traumas get, the more trauma I have, the more it drowns out the other part of me, which is my higher self, which is another part. It just gets drowned out by all these other vibrations that get triggered, or all these traumas, habit patterns, creatures, beings in my system. So what I experienced in my last journey that I shared around the last day of the journey, where I was taken to my deepest trauma, ancestral trauma, where I felt like there were beings or entities, demons and dragons that arose and overwhelming me, and I felt like I was teetering on the edge of insanity. Like I felt like I could get overtaken by depression or anxiety or fear or whatever, exactly like people with severe mental illness talk about. But the difference was I've been, my higher self, I've been clearing enough to have my higher self in place. It's actually what took me to those dark places to clear my system even further. So it was able to bring me back to my heart, like I was talking about, get me to ground the energy, use tools that I'd learned along the way to basically heal and release that trauma from my system so that I don't get overtaken. But I remember even then I was like, I would get swept away and overwhelmed by these beings, these entities that I could see could keep me. And which is why they say for some of these really deep healing methodologies like Vipassana or like psychedelics and so on, there's a risk of ending up with a psychotic break. Because when those traumas come to the surface, those entities, those beings, they can overwhelm the system. And if you don't have the tools, techniques, or support to get out of it, you could be stuck in that place. So what I believe now that I'm being led to is a way to help people that have anyone really. But because if you think about it, the way I was even describing my own experience was, as I healed my trauma, cleared the instrument, these habit patterns, I was hearing less voices, angel and devil, do this, do that. And I was ending up with what felt more of one larger single voice, that was my higher self, that would, when I listened to it, it would take me to all of these amazing, magical, incredible things. So now the journey is, how do we help people with severe physical and mental illness through these kinds of tools that allow them to start to heal? Stay tuned, it's super exciting. Talk to you soon.